We'll get started today, and thank you all for coming to this session. Thank you for attending. It's just great to see. I've got the attendees' names so I can see where you are. Again, if you feel more comfortable with your camera off, please feel free to keep that off or turn it off if you need to save some bandwidth. But the first thing I do want to do is to acknowledge where we are in this world. I want to acknowledge and give gratitude to the vast traditional lands that we're on, as well as the territories that we occupy, to really enable us today to come together. And so just very quickly, I wanted to introduce our panel. So I'm Lisa Federick, and I'm representing the University of Calgary. And Jenny, if you could give a little bit of a wave. Jenny Godley is also at the University of Calgary. And then we have Rachel Gitman, who's at York University and sort of a little bit part-time working on the journal at McMaster. So if Rachel's around here somewhere.
Yes, sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. I just was getting a little bit disconnected, but hello.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel, no problem. Then Gabriella Lindstrom is also representing the University of Calgary. Denise Stockley is, I see Rachel come back on. Denise Stockley is from Queen's University in Canada as well. Cherie Woolmer is from Mount Royal University in Calgary. And then Madison Wright is representing the University of Guelph and Queen's University. So welcome, everybody. I think what I wanted to do is really give you a bit of a context to begin with on sort of the idea of starting a dialogue. And so I have to say that I just put up on the slides here, I found a couple of different word clouds because having conversations around ethics and the scholarship of teaching and learning has pulled out so many different themes, topics, and conversations that we've actually been having for years. And even more recently, those conversations have started to really evolve within our roles and our contexts in academia, specifically with COVID-19, putting us in different predicaments and in some precarious situations. So because of the vast topics underneath the umbrella of ethics in the scholarship of teaching and learning, we've really engaged in these dialogues. And an idea in about February came about from having talks with folks about developing actually a book. And so I did sort of an informal survey to scholars sort of around the world, and we actually have about 40 plus international contributing authors that are helping to contribute to a book. And so from that sort of informal survey, what I've done is chosen 3 topics that we've highlighted that we will be talking about and addressing today. And those topics are really making meaning through our own context of what we feel and how we understand what ethics and SOTL is. We'll be talking about students as partners, and then thirdly, the academic community partnerships. So as a group, we had gotten together a couple of weeks ago and we were really talking about what we want to accomplish today. And so we set an intention of really engaging in dialogue in a very fluid and organic discussion method based on our own contexts. So really being open and honest about how we make meaning in different ways underneath this umbrella of ethics and the scholarship of teaching and learning. And we invite you all to join us through a conversation and through an awareness that we are co-creating a safe space for transparency and vulnerability. So I just wanted to pop now down to this next slide. Oops, sorry, right here. And you'll see that there is a statement that I've put up, and we have committed to each other that we do come to this panel with the intention of engaging in an open and fluid discussion about ethics and SOTL. So it says each of us makes meaning of ethics and SOTL within and through our own critical lens by way of cultivating an ethical mindset, exploring SOTL's relational orientation and notion of relational accountability, and navigating its challenges and possibilities. So as a panel, what we are doing is committing to stick to this statement. And again, either through the raised hand or through unmuting your mic, we do invite you to join the discussion. And our aim right now is just through storytelling and sharing your narratives to have this dialogue and to co-create together. So the first area that we thought we would talk about, and this is why I didn't introduce everybody in depth, is to give them a chance to explain to this wonderful group a little bit about what their experience has been in and with ethics and SOTL and how they've come to make meaning of this concept. So maybe randomly what I'll do is just kind of on my screen give the mic up to our panel to give them 5 or 6 minutes to talk a little bit about how they've come to ethics and the SOTL and the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So Cherie, can I give the mic over to you?
Sure, thanks, Lisa. Happy to kick off. I'm Cherie Woolmer, Assistant Professor in Canada Research Chair based in SOTL, based at Mount Royal University. And I think I bring 3 distinct perspectives to the discussion today and my understanding of ethics within SOTL. I engage in my own SOTL research. I support faculty within Mount Royal and beyond who are engaging in SOTL, particularly as novice scholars in the field. So introducing some of the different and particular ethical dynamics and dimensions that come up within the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And I'm also an advocate for and a practitioner of working with students as partners in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. One particular issue I'm going to share and talk about perhaps in a little bit more detail that I'm particularly interested in at the moment is the idea of the dual role when we talk about ethics in SOTL. And I'm quite interested in kind of challenging and expanding and exploring what we understand by the notion of the dual role, because my experience increasingly is in working with students in particular, but also working with faculty who are interested in community engagement and in teaching and learning and so on. I find the idea of dual role a limiting one, actually, when we think about ethics. And I'm keen to explore the ways in which we can think about that in a more expansive way. So that's kind of one of the things that's occupying my mind at the moment. And just as a SOTL scholar myself, I'm always interested in engaging in ethical conversations that come from a place of SOTL's remit being about doing good and not just thinking about ethics in terms of do no harm. So where can we take the conversation about ethics in SOTL to do good? And I think with that, I'll pause and hand over to who's going to speak next, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cherie. That's wonderful. Actually, the connection Cherie has to Rachel is via a student. So maybe Rachel, I'll hand the mic over to you to talk a little bit about your experience.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm definitely connected to Cherie in my work in SOTL. It's been mostly my engagement has been in students as partners, both engaging in students as partners work as a student partner and also conducting research as a student partner. And more recently, since I'm now a student again because I'm a grad student, but I had a gap of just being a staff member. So I actually also engaged in one partnership as a staff member. And so I've long thought about shifting roles as well within SOTL in general and in students as partners, especially because that transition or change of roles is very interesting, I think, because obviously the kind of power structures change a little bit. And I think that that's something that I want to think about and explore. And I'm also interested in how different positionalities and social positions and locations affect our engagement in things like students as partners or SOTL research more broadly. And think my commitment and interest in SOTL and in students as partners is very informed by caring about ethics and ethical ways of doing pedagogy, teaching and learning experiences in general. Yeah, so I think I've made meaning of that concept of ethics in SOTL, especially through students as partners, because I see that as an ethical way to practice SOTL research, but also, I mean, in my experience, it's been research, but also I think that there are lots of questions and tensions around social identities and experiences within there as well.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's always great to hear the perspective of a recent student and also more of an academic faculty member as well. So that's certainly something that I really appreciate. And bridging from Rachel, we do have Madison with us today, who has also been a student and has also been part of faculty. So I might give the mic over to you, Madison, to sort of bridge your experience as well in those two, those almost dual roles of student and faculty, so in a different way.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so I first should give my background. I'm a microbiologist by training, and so I am not, the bacteria do not have rights and they do not need ethics approval. We can take their genes out, we can put them back in, we can make them glow green, and nobody's concerned about what we do to them. And so for me, actually ethics was a barrier to doing SOTL because it's not part of my disciplinary background, and so it was a new field. And often through colleagues, you hear about some grumblings about having to do ethics and different challenges, but never personally experiencing that for myself. And so when I was first studying my PhD, I actually first learned about SOTL. I didn't know that there's people out there that study teaching, to be quite frank with everyone. And after I found out, I was like, this is amazing. Like, I love this. How can I do this? And that's when I found the barrier of ethics, because it's something that I didn't know how to do. Nobody in my department really does it. And so in that place and space, and also SOTL has different methodologies from my discipline. And so I found lots of barriers, and through that, a good solution that I found was finding mentorship. And that's the connection between me and Denise actually on this panel. Sorry. And so Denise has taken me under her wing and has been able to help guide me through the field of SOTL as well as ethics. And so that's why I have dual affiliations. And to correctly say, I'm not a faculty member yet. I'm a sessional lecturer, but thank you for that promotion. I loved that. But yeah, I do hold many titles. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm the Senior Graduate Educational Developer in the Office of Teaching and Learning, Research Associate with Denise, and sessional lecturer for a course that I designed. And so many hats, but they all lead me to being very fascinated with SOTL. And I think that this new space in place is the perspective that I bring and the challenges that that can bring. And then the other thing I'll mention is I do work with Denise on quite a large data set, but I will not steal her thunder there, but happy to speak about that perspective as well.
Thank you so much, Madison. So I won't steal Denise's thunder either, but I'll give her the mic to just give us a little bit of background about her context within ethics and scholarship teaching and learning.
Thank you for that. And I was going to say there's no stealing of thunder, because issues relating to SOTL and ethics are things that I want to be so widespread. So my background actually is I'm an educational psychologist. So my PhD training is studying how people learn, which is part of what SOTL is about. So I actually come from this from a disciplinary cognate home. So I often use the term SOTL differently in the sense because this is what I actually was trained to do, is to do that. But I do study in my own classroom quite often. So that's where I get excited by it, because then it's like, okay, when do I slip in? But I have been part of, for those who are from Canada and doing ethics, you're very familiar with the Tri-Council Policy Statement -2, soon to be coming out with the latest and greatest version. So we have a secretariat responsible for research ethics in Canada. And as part of that, I had the privilege of being part of the 2014 launch and worked with them for a couple of years before that, getting ready for the launch from a teaching and learning point of view, because before that was, they put out statements and then they let them sit. Whereas when they did the big launch in 2014, they decided to do a cross-Canada tour. And we collected data on the webinars that they did after that cross-Canada tour, as well as data at that. We also did a national survey. And part of that, and where I'm giving that as context, there's a lot of people who love and hate ethics because of where it sits and then situated depending on where you live. And each of you, depending on your country, will have your own ethics boards and processes you navigate. But one of the issues that I really want to draw attention to from an ethics point of view, and ISSOTL, is the absence of it currently in the current draft version of the TCPS-2. And in 2013, my colleague from the Secretariat, Laura Lee Bockwell, and I published an article in CJ-ISSOTL, Canadian Journal of Scholarship and Teaching and Learning, on raising awareness of research ethics with educational developers, because often as educational developers, we're the front line of faculty who are saying, I'm interested in exploring this and I'm not quite sure what does it mean. And as the front line, it's up to us to say, have you thought about research ethics? Because we have colleagues like Madison who it is not part of their traditions in their discipline, and it's up to us to do that. And that was a real shift in thinking of saying, do we have a role in this? Is it a role of a center to talk about research ethics and things like that? And so that's where I got, I shouldn't say got, I've research ethics, I will admit, I started doing them back in the day when we called people subjects. So it's been a long-standing thing that I have been interested in, both as a participant, as in doing ethics forums, and I get cranky with some, because I don't know about other countries, but in Canada, if you want to do cross-Canadian ethics, you actually have to go to every institution to get permission. Fantastic, but there are some institutions that interpret the policy differently, and so it makes for very fascinating research, especially if you want to do collaborative ISSOTL work. So with that, what was alluded to, we actually have a database or surveys. It's still being collected daily, so if you went to do the course on human research with the Secretariat, and we do have international people who've done that, because international collaborators working with Canadian researchers still have to do it. Not my decision, that's actually institutional at your own institution that makes the decision, but we have over 109,000 surveys, 109,927 to be exact, of people who've completed it, yes. And if you know statistics, you know that that's actually a real problem. It's actually not a gift, because everything is statistically significant as soon as we went over 5,000. Having said that, we are using the data. I use it from a research point of view, but it does serve a purpose of program evaluation for the Secretariat. So we are collecting the data because they dip in every so often to see where some of the issues and concerns are. And the upcoming draft of the new TCPS will have elements of that feedback in there. So very exciting. But there is a glaring absence of ISSOTL. And what that means is that each institution has interpreted their own ISSOTL policies internally. And so, yeah, research ethic boards are creating their own definition of that, which does make it difficult for cross-Canadian collaboration. And so that's where my lens is really wanting to raise awareness, but also say, we can do better, and we collectively on how we do it. So there we go. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Denise. I mean, that's excellent. And this ties in really nicely to some of the work that Jenny has been doing. So what I'll do, maybe Jenny, is pass over the mic to you, because there's a close-knit attachment there to the Tri-Council policy statement and the Research Ethics Board at U of C.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. I'm very pleased to be here, and nice to see everybody and see all our attendees. Thank you for attending. My name's Jenny Godley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Calgary. I'm an associate professor in sociology and also adjunct in community health sciences. So but I'm also the chair of one of our research ethics boards. So that's the other hat that I wear. But I'm going to start with my first two hats, just to give you a little bit of background about why I'm interested in research ethics. Most of my work is quantitative, and I do work on health. And I started out working in the developing world on reproductive health way back when. And so in the early 90s, I lived in Thailand for several years, and I did a lot of work on reproductive health there right after my undergrad. And it was really a time of reckoning for demographers, where we really started to realize how much research had been done mainly on new forms of reproductive medicine that had been done in the developing world because it couldn't be done elsewhere. And so I was involved with quite a lot of people who had done work on, for example, Depo-Provera, IUDs, things like that, that were tested on women in the developing world, and really coming to understand that that probably hadn't been done in a completely ethical way. Whether it was that truly informed consent wasn't given, or that the incentives for taking reproductive medicine were so high that they were actually coercive. There were lots of things going on there. At the same time, we were sort of looking back in history, but at the same time, HIV was really becoming a problem in that part of the world. And there were some trials that were going on vaginal microbicides, which was a female-controlled ointment that you would put on that would prevent HIV, they thought would prevent HIV transmission. And the way that those trials were out of Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and the way those trials were run, they tested the vaginal microbicide on sex workers. And the reason for that was that they needed enough sexual encounters that were unprotected that they could see whether it worked or not. So they needed that control group, if you will, where nobody was wearing a condom, etc. And of course, this was terribly problematic. And this was the mid-90s. This was not that long ago. Those trials were stopped. But that was really my first introduction to research ethics, was thinking about what I now know is termed ethics dumping, and how does research happen around the world in ways that are perhaps wouldn't be considered ethical in certain places and are kind of okay in other places. So fast forward many years, I don't actually do work on reproductive health anymore, but I have over the years been really interested in these ethical issues, particularly around research that involves medicine, but also becoming more and more interested in thinking about risks and harms as they are more complicated, perhaps, maybe not quite as obvious, but more complicated in social science research. So I joined the ethics board at the University of Calgary in 2017, and I became the chair in 2019. So I've been in that role for a couple of years now. And really have enjoyed, I'm on the social science side. We have two ethics boards. So I've really enjoyed getting to know all the different types of research that go on. And part of that was getting to meet Lisa and her colleagues and learning about ISSOTL, which I honestly, a bit like you, Madison, did not know much about. Have since been able to do a ISSOTL project myself, which has been a great joy and really exciting. And so getting to know Lisa and really coming to understand how the ethical principles that I try to uphold and that we try to teach people about in all the different subjects that we look at, how they might be similar in ISSOTL and then slightly different in ISSOTL, including things like Sherry was talking about, the dual role of researcher and professor, and what does it mean to ask a student to be in a research project when you're also giving them a grade, those kinds of questions. But what's been really interesting to relate to Denise is the, I would say, institutional barriers we face in terms of getting some consistency around how we assess ISSOTL files. Part of the issue, and this is something I'm interested in with my sociology hat on, is who owns the data? So for example, somebody wants to do research using grades. Who owns the grades? Who's the data steward for the grades? Are you allowed to use grades in your research project? Do you need consent from your students to use grades? Those kinds of things. And I've been absolutely shocked at how little is in place just at my institution. So Denise, I can only imagine that if you start looking cross-institutionally, how different these things are in terms of understanding what data is available, what data is able to be used, what data do you need consent for, those kinds of questions. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And the partnership piece for me really has been becoming partners with the Teaching and Learning Institute on our campus through relationships with Lisa and Gabrielle and other people who work at the Teaching and Learning Institute. And so really coming out of that taking myself out of that disciplinary focus, so not just being a sociologist or a psychologist, but going to the Teaching and Learning Institute and really trying to learn about what different people are doing around using SOTL research, but all the many different ways that people do that, including different methodologies. As I said, I come from a quantitative background, but really learning more about the qualitative as well. And then there was one last thing I was going to say about teaching and learning. Now I'm blanking. Sorry, I'll stop there. I'll think of it later.
No passion at all, Jenny, none. Thank you so much for that. I think it's just, and this is where we always fall into trouble, is with time, because we all have such diverse and vast backgrounds of how we've experienced ethics and the scholarship of teaching and learning, and we come from such different conceptual lenses. So what I'd like to do is pass the mic over to Gabrielle as well, to just explain a little bit about her experience within SOTL from her conceptual and contextual lens.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to my colleagues for beautifully outlining your positioning in the context of SOTL. I hope people can hear me all right. Oh, great. Okay, I've had some connectivity issues, so I'm just going to back up and introduce myself. So, Oki, Nistoni Daniko Tabinaki. My name is Gabriella Lindstrom. Nimoch do Gena. I'm from the Blackfoot speaking tribes and a member of the Nitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy. How I make meaning of SOTL is directly connected to my cultural positioning and where I come from, who I'm related to, and my experiences within a context that is very, very different than a Western sort of academic way of thinking about SOTL and ethics. And so it's interesting that, and this isn't a slight in the least bit about the scientific paradigm, but it was when thinking about, say, the ethics behind microbiology, I was really struck, Madison, when you said that no one really is concerned with how microbes are treated. For Indigenous people, our cultural ways of knowing are shaped by our ethical accountabilities within a relational paradigm. And what that means is we are accountable to and recognize that living entities, living energies, we are accountable to those. So when we renew our relationships, it's with all of our relatives, including those microbes. And so we are indeed accountable to those. When my grandfather, who was a healer, when he was doing his healing ceremonies and his cleansings, he was making offerings to the unseen, to those unseen energies that can bring about sickness, but that can also bring about wellness. And from an Indigenous point of view, our brain is our who we are actually originates from our gut. And so being in relation to our microbes in our gut is directly connected to our well-being. So we are indeed accountable to those microbes. And so thinking about that, how are we broadening our understanding of our ethical relationships and our ethical accountabilities within these relationships? As Lisa had said, SOTL and ethics emerges from this notion of relational accountability. So how are we, and this is what I'm concerned with in my research and what I do with students as well as, and in my life in general, I don't see a distinction between the two. I teach who I am, I research who I am, and I make relationships in that way. Nitsitapi translates to the real people, meaning you come into every relationship with full knowledge of who you you are, where you come from, and what your purpose on earth here is for. And so when I do that, my ethics and thinking about ethics, I'm very concerned with advancing this more panoramic view of ethics and bringing that into the work that I do. So I truly make meaning of ethics in the context of how I was raised, as contextualized within my experiences of oppression, but also contextualized within my relational accountabilities that extend beyond that which is seen and beyond the physical. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And in these co-constructed dialogues and conversations, this is what we learn, is we learn that we're so very much connected, yet we have very different perspectives. And this, again, is one of the aims of having this panel and having this conversation, is to really uncover those differences, but also celebrate our commonalities as well with underneath this umbrella. So thank you all so much for your wonderful introductions and how you've come to make meaning of ethics and the scholarship of teaching and learning. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, and I'm very conscious of time because I know we could spend half a day or more talking about a lot of these pieces. But I wanted to shift gears just a little bit because at the forefront of ISSOTL is really our connection to understanding and learning about students learning, as well as teaching practices. And that's really what we study when we are in this field. So what I might ask maybe, I know earlier Cherie was talking about sort of that dual role, and I know that she has a vast background that looks specifically at student partnerships. So I'm wondering if maybe the next question is asking if we can talk a little bit about your understanding and experiences of ethical mindedness surrounding the concept of students as partners as one of Felton's areas to consider when we're doing this kind of scholarship.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I kind of want to just come at this with humility and say right off the bat that I'm still learning as I go in my own scholarship with working through some of these ethical dimensions, but perhaps just to throw in some of the experiences that I've had individually in encountering ethics boards, but also in the advocacy of I think there's an ethical imperative actually when thinking about scholarship of teaching and learning for us to bring students, for us as gatekeepers to provide opportunities for students to come in and inform and conduct and analyze data on student learning. So I come from a place of, I feel there's actually an ethical imperative for us to be thinking about conducting ISSOTL in this way. Some of the feedback that I've received and in working in different institutions is from ethics boards is, oh, but there's a conflict of interest, a concern that students might be interviewing or seeing or collecting data on peers. Yet the research emerging from Students as Partners work shows that actually there's many opportunities and gains from involving students as researchers, as people involved in data collection, data analysis, research design, right from the point of deciding and informing what are the important questions to be asking of their other student peers. And sometimes it's challenging to have to enter into dialogue with ethics boards and board reviewers around making the case. But I have had some successes in justifying why, with the same principles of kind of participant action research, I see many similarities here. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be really pushing ourselves. And this is why I say I come with humility in learning how to articulate those similarities with other research approaches that can inform ISSOTL. Being able to say, and advocate for the benefits of bringing somebody from the community of whom we want to understand their learning, bringing those individuals into the research process. And then there are a number of other ways, thinking about the idea of avoiding coercive practices, respecting confidentiality, giving choice. I've actually found that in some research, taking approach where a participant, a student, would have the opportunity and choice to be interviewed by someone like myself or somebody who is a student, actually broadens the idea of choice and informed consent. And then I think working with student scholars, and I really want to give Rachel some space to speak to this too, who just as faculty entering into scholarship of teaching and learning, for students, giving time and space for bringing students as researchers into SOTL, for them to engage deeply, meaningfully in an exploratory way around what does ethics mean in this space. Quite often their first encounter can be when we're writing the ethics application, or they're doing the core training module that Denise talked about. And I think there's, again, an ethical responsibility on those of us who are PIs in SOTL projects to make time to kind of have more deeper conversations with students around ethical responsibilities and opportunities. So I think they're just some of I could talk at length around some of those dimensions, but I think those are some of the practical things that I see, and based in some of the questions that I've received from research ethics boards around justifying working with students as partners in SOTL.
Yeah, so many areas that we have to explore within this concept, and you articulated that so well. In terms of the equity piece, I would love to give the mic over to Rachel just to explore her understanding too of her experience working with Cherie.
Yes, so I've engaged in research with Cherie and other faculty partners as a student. And I'm now a master's student, but I did that as an undergraduate student. And I think that students as partners, to me, is an ethical practice in itself. I do agree with Cherie. I think there's an imperative to bring in students. And as someone who's benefited from that, of course, I'm saying that from my position, but I think I've really experienced the benefits of it. To me, it made my educational experience extremely participatory and engaging, like Cherie engaging me and creating that space. I also do get concerned about the kind of ethical dimensions of who does get involved. Like, I recognize my own privileges and social position. That have influenced also my opportunities, and I do get concerned about who it is that's being involved in partnerships. I think my experience of the kind of realm of students as partnerships is that it's a predominantly white space. I'm concerned about the kind of to think about always who's not included or whose voices are not there. And I think similarly, it is important to I also think about the social positions of faculty members who are included, in some of the research that Cherie and I have done in the past was about this, and about the different experiences of faculty and staff in relation to partnership, not just experiences, but perceptions of partnership based on their own social position, because there are different.
So I'm just going to pop in now because I'm not sure if we lost Rachel. Oh, she might be back. Rachel, if you can hear me.
Okay, I can hear you.
Yeah, you're just cutting in and out. So I just kind of was summarizing, thinking about summarizing what you were talking about by way of equity, by way of social justice. I think those are the topics that that had come about. And absolutely, yes. I mean, these again are these massive gaps that I believe that we need to have this co-constructed dialogue about, because they are glaring gaps within the literature and also within applied research as well. Now, thank you all very much for tackling this question, because particularly, you know, students as partners as a concept is, again, we could write another book, and many books have been written about it, looking at what the contextual feeling, the contextual, the concept surrounding of it, really, with how we go about understanding that. So what I would like to do at this point, I'm just looking at the time as well. I know we could talk so much more about this, but I just wanted to tackle one more area before I open it up to our whole group, if they have some questions coming up. But this area that forming partnerships with students is certainly important, but it's also, what are some of the challenges and opportunities some of the panel has had by way of building academic community partnerships? And this question really comes from a space of, you know, typically working in silos, and typically novice researchers, if they're wanting to do some work with humans as participants and experiencing REBs, what are the stigmas around that? So what I might do is open it up right now to Denise, if you wanted to chat a little bit about your experience working with so many different faculties, I guess, and working with so many different researchers, perhaps talking a little bit about how you've come to experience academic community partnerships.
Sure, thank you. So as I was mentioning earlier, one of the biggest challenges that we have is actually navigating the local research ethics boards if we're going outside of our own institution. And unfortunately, it has meant that some of the people who wanted to collaborate haven't been able to because of their own challenges within the boards. But what we have done with our own research is really looking at who has access to data so that we don't exclude people from our academic partnerships, because research ethics is about who actually touches the data itself and is part of that. So we have, that is sort of what I would say was the biggest challenge, but I would actually like to go to the biggest excitement. One of the things that I get really impressed with is somebody will bounce an idea off at a conference, for example, and somebody else says, I'm interested in that, or I'm interested in that. And a lot of partnerships, whether they end up in publication or creating networks, is based on informal dialogues happening. And so looking at it from that end. And so what I would suggest is that for when I think about academic partnerships, it's really about going outside of my own institution, you know, and more importantly, who can we bring in? And more importantly, who will bring me in? Because I mean, I get invited to lots of fun different tables for different reasons. I really believe in the idea of students as not just as partners, but as students as owners of the research that I participate in. And it changes the conversation as well, because ownership isn't about who's at the table first or who has the expertise. It's who actually has the ideas and is willing to work on it. And so our ethics boards and our processes aren't necessarily aligned as clearly or as succinctly as to who owns what and with what purpose. So I encourage people. In fact, a lot of my research is about creating communities, and I find that the larger, and I don't mean larger as in body-wise, but the larger the ISSOTL-based communities that I participate in, the more exciting it gets, because there's always somebody, as year is, you know, ebbs and flows of energy, somebody else is willing to take up that energy and keep it going. So I love collaborating and do it quite often from that end. But I do worry about which opportunities are being closed because of our local processes and practices in absence of a national strategy or policy.
Yes, thank you so much. Brings up such a great point. I wanted just to pass the mic over to Jenny, because again, she's got this bridge that it sort of is on the same thematic pattern, Denise, that you were just talking about. So I'm wondering if Jenny, you might be able to add to that a little bit.
Sure. Sorry, I'm losing bandwidth as well, so I turned my camera off. Yes, I think the partnership piece is very interesting, and I think what we're trying to do, certainly at the University of Calgary, is bring together a lot of partnerships, for example, with experiential learning. So partnerships with community-based organizations that also tie into SOTL research, that kind of thing. And again, I just want to echo what Denise says. In the absence of a kind of national standard, I think these things get very blurry. And I just wanted to also comment, Lisa, if it's okay, we've been having a bit of a chat in the chat box, and I'm sorry, I'm very bad at doing two things at once, so I'm a bit focused on that. But whether research is evaluation or not and when it's exempt, is it okay if I talk about that for a second?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's
sorry, I know it's not exactly
but
so this is very interesting to me because again, and Denise, you probably know way more about this than I do, but in my, fairly new role of understanding all this or trying to understand all this stuff in my role as chair, my understanding in Canada is, if you go by our document, which is called the TCPS, which Denise referenced, is that if the data is originally collected for evaluation purposes, it's exempt from ethics review. However, many people then go on to publish from data that was originally collected for evaluation purposes. The way that we look at that really depends, at least on my board, it really depends on it's very contextual. Depends on what the data were, depends on who was involved, it depends on the potential risk. Are people identifiable? Those kinds of questions. If you are originally doing a SOTL project for research purposes, you are supposed to undergo ethics review in the Canadian context, if it's research. My understanding, Chris, it looks like you're in the States. My understanding is that things are quite different there. And I'll tell you one interesting thing, speaking of partnerships, we have a lot of issues when we have professors who come from the States. So I get a lot of pushback as an ethics chair from SOTL researchers who have moved up here from the States, and they say, wait a minute, I don't need ethics for that. I don't need to get ethics review for that because of the different systems. So I don't know, Denise, if you have any experience with that, but I found that quite challenging, trying to explain, maybe I don't understand enough the different systems, but trying to explain the different perspectives across the border there.
If I could just step in, Lisa, for just 1 second. What was fascinating is that, I guess it depends what you find fascinating, but with the TCPS, the original, it actually said you need ethics if you're going to publish. And it was clear. I'm going public and I need ethics. With the TCPS too, what it said was if you're doing quality improvement or program evaluation, you do not require ethics and to publish. So you can still publish and do everything that you would. So it wasn't as clear, which is where the interpretation came from. I usually give the example of the survey I was just referring to. If the secretariat responsible for research ethics was to do that survey, they would not require research ethics because it is program evaluation. I am not an ethicist. I am an educational psychologist. Therefore, I came into that with a research question about how learning takes place with ethics. So therefore, I required research ethics in order to do that survey. So it also comes down to positionality as to whether you need ethics or not. And I started with a research question. And they did, and that was a huge debate even within the secretariat as to whether I needed ethics or not. But that's not my field, and I wasn't doing program evaluation.
What a great example.
Yeah, it makes life more interesting, but that's what it comes down to. I can't imagine research ethics worse debating. So
yeah, that's a terrific example. Yeah, and I think so great example. So the positionality of the researcher, what is intended to happen with the data. The thing I find interesting too is that I don't actually like it when people sort of want to be exempt from ethics, because I think that it encourages this mindset that ethics is just a barrier you have to jump through, that the ethics board is just a tick box that you have to go through. I'm much happier when people come to me and say, can we talk about my project? What are some of the ethical issues that might come up? Because of course, just because it's exempt from ethics review does not mean that there might not still be ethical issues For example, how are you including your students as partners? Are they going to be co-authors? Those kinds of questions, right? So I think I like to try to encourage researchers to not just ask me, can I not do this? But to talk a bit more about, you know, how can we help you design your project in an ethical way with our background, which is different from yours, whether it has to go through ethics review or not, I guess. Yeah, not thinking of us quite as much as the police. Yeah, sorry, Madison, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in here because you're echoing a thought that I had as someone who was not part of ethics in a discipline. Actually, after I completed core, I was so envious of everyone that gets to use ethics as part of their discipline, because I just think the idea of having this panel of people review your research in depth before you begin is just so valuable, because you have all of these experts with different perspectives all looking at your project, opposed to my discipline where we're all from the same discipline with the same backgrounds looking at something, and then we experience the peer review at the publication stage, and someone comes in and they're like, oh, you never thought of that. And when I did core, I was like, wouldn't it be nice to have that person at the start of the project? Where were they in the design phase? So yeah, just wanted to include that perspective that as someone not part of the discipline, I do hear the grumblings, but my perspective is, wow, can we have that for me? I'd love someone to review it before I start.
Gabe, I'd love for you to jump in as well. Please go right ahead.
Thank you, Lisa. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. And it's really about making the implicit explicit is where I'm most concerned with, I think. And the power relations that are embedded in our institutional hierarchies oftentimes make ethics and going through the whole ethical review process a very oppressive experience, and that has certainly been my experience. And so thinking about academic partnerships, students as partners, from the way I do things and the way I think, how I think about things, which are definitely culturally determined as really everything is, rather than partnerships which really denotes a more formal arrangement, being in relation with students, being in relation with the knowledge that we're creating, being in relation with our academic partners, that really adds a layer of relational accountability. So how are we reframing our and making the implicit very explicit in ethics, right? So these assumptions about and approaches to leadership, I guess, and even our students as partners are they're deeply embedded in our partnerships, in our relationships. And I think one's relationship to power is going to frame that relationship with students and that relationship with ethics, okay? And so as one who has been historically disempowered and continues to be disempowered, and the Indigenous voice is really left out of institutional priorities, academic processes, I think it's really important to reflect critically on one's relationship to power. So knowing one's own relationship to power, I think really helps us to ensure that we're not, as researchers, imposing on our power on others in ways that disempower them. So I think the Western knowledge system is really deeply rooted in these hierarchies of power, which influence our student as partner relationships and our relationships to ethics, because really, from a cultural perspective, from an Indigenous perspective, I see ethics as part of my ontological responsibilities. From a Western perspective, I see ethics as this big boogeyman that I have to face whenever I'm submitting ethics applications. And so I just wanted to put that out there. I know we're just about out of time, but I thought it was important to mention that.
Absolutely. No, I think this is really an interesting, and this again is a topic on its own. But I think, as the audience is listening too, I'm hoping that you can sort of see and hear the themes of all of these huge areas and topics underneath this umbrella, how they really morph and come together. And I see Denise is just putting up the ethics police, which really ties exactly into that stigmatization of just the word in itself. So what I'd like to do, the seduction of ethics as well. So we have two very different paradigms there in those titles. I do want to take these last few minutes here, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes, just to open it up to anyone who has, a question, a comment, wants to engage in the conversation from their perspective, just to allow that space. We've talked about these areas, these 3 big areas. Sorry, I'm just going to try to move my slide down here. So how we make meaning of ethics in the scholarship of teaching and learning from our contexts. We talked a little bit about students as partners and that concept. And then, of course, we've been talking about academic community partnerships. So does anybody have any kind of thoughts, or from the panel members as well, or sort of some words or a question or comment? I'm just going to leave it open at this point.
Maybe I'll step in if that's okay. Just to thank Gabrielle for her comments, and to just maybe tell a little bit about what we're doing here, which I don't know if this is being echoed at other institutions, but at the University of Calgary, we do have an Indigenous strategy. And one of the things that we're doing on the ethics board is really trying to take that strategy and make some big changes. We don't know what those will be yet. Those are hopefully going to be led by the Indigenous scholars on campus. One of the things we've done as we are currently constituted as a board is we've added several Indigenous scholars to the board, which I do think obviously enhances the board tremendously and brings diversity to the board that we didn't have before. We also have all of our members, we got a grant from our Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement for all of our members to take OCAP training. So all of our board members have now had the OCAP training, which is training, for those of you who aren't situated in Canada, it stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And it's training based around thinking about First Nations ethical responsibilities while you're doing research, particularly with First Nations, but also applies to all Indigenous research, I think. And then one of the things we're in discussion with our Indigenous scholars is having a different kind of process, a parallel process that maybe would involve an oral ethics application. It would involve Indigenous scholars being able to be in discussion with the ethics board rather than having this terrible system that we have now where it's all anonymous. And as Gabrielle points out, it's really not relational at all, because you fill out your application online and you get your comments back online and you have no idea who reviewed your application. So I think some of that we're hoping to move towards a more ethical ethics board, if I can put it that way, or process. And the thing I like to stress about this is that these learnings, although we're very much at the beginning of our journey learning all of these things from our Indigenous colleagues and from Indigenous teachings, these learnings have really, I think, improved the way we function as a board, the way we treat each other as a board, and I think they've improved the way we treat researchers. I may be speaking out of turn because I'm the board chair, so I have a bit of a biased view, of course. But I think that we have made some changes that have come from our learnings from our Indigenous colleagues that have benefited the entire university and the entire board. And so I think that's really important to stress, is that hopefully in my mind, that's the huge benefit. Obviously, there are many benefits of indigenization, but the huge benefit is that we're taking these learnings and improving our relationships across the university. So I don't know if Lisa would like to speak to that a little bit, because she's actually a board member. But I just wanted to mention that. So thank you, Gabrielle, for your comments.
No, absolutely. No, I thank you very much. I know it's tough and we're at the 11:40 mark, but absolutely, Jenny, I've been able to really open up my perspective by way of being a board member and by way of also taking up opportunities to learn more and more about different ways of doing, seeing, hearing, and experiencing things. And that comes from the Indigenous strategy and my friendship with Gabrielle. And so I think it's really important for us to not try to fit everybody in a text box and really open up the space again for positionality, for relationality, and really have these really important discussions and dialogues together as co-creating, more opportunities for exchange of what we're actually doing across Canada, but also across the globe. So I do want to take this time to thank the panel for their time, and I want to thank all of the participants, the attendees who came to the panel. We weren't sure how many we would have, so thank you for listening. And in this methodology we used, it really was just about having dialogue. So thank you for listening. And thank you for contributing in the discussion box. And we're around at our institute. So all I have to do is Google us if you want to continue this conversation. And so for right now, I will bid you adieu and a happy conferencing for the rest of the day. And thanks again to the panel members and to everybody for their contributions. So I'll stick around for a little bit if anybody wants to have a chat, but I will say goodbye to everybody else who needs to run to another session. So thanks, everyone.